Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Themes and Variations, the Aldous Huxley podcast, a production of the Aldous Huxley Centre in Zurich, featuring me, Tobias Harris, and the Centre's curator and author of Aldous Huxley for Beginners, Robin Hull, as well as our occasionally invited guests. Today, we will be starting to look at Huxley's political and economic ideas for the wider world. These are ideas, pacifism, non-attachment, non-violence, which were remarkable enough at the time, although perhaps they were more popular than people realize, but may seem even more shocking and remarkable to us now in a world where, if we're honest, war and violence seem inevitable whatever side you're on. We will start to look how Huxley's view of personal psychology extends into these larger scale political ideas, and we'll also start to refer to a book called Ends and Means, which Huxley published in 1937. It's a very big book that is very simple in its basic idea, that a means we use to do something will determine the ends, what actually happens, but it's very broad indeed in its range. And so we'll only talk about some of the most important themes before we get into more detail later. And somehow I feel like this time we may even end up touching on Brave New World, which we have avoided doing so far. So we'll find out if we do. But welcome back to the podcast, Robin. How are you doing?
Fine, thanks. Lovely to see you.
Excellent. So I wanted to start by a discussion where we would be trying to understand the political world, the wider world Huxley was facing in the 1930s when his ideas were developing around pacifism. So I suppose most listeners wouldn't know just how heavily involved Aldous Huxley was in the pacifist movement, which really campaigned for World War II not to start. And given the context that we live in now, people may also wonder why there was a movement, because broadly this is seen as a necessary and sort of just war nowadays. So I think it's helpful if we could maybe try to take a trip back to the world that Aldous Huxley lived in, because it is perhaps a different world to the one that people might be thinking of when they think about the aftermath of the war. It's a world where there are still colonial empires. Colonialism is still the major mode of interaction between, the West and the rest of the world. And there's different economic systems. There's capitalism in some countries, there's communism in others. And of course, there are extremely oppressive societies that have taken root in Europe and in Russia. So I guess to start to help us understand this, could you talk to me a bit about the world that Aldous Huxley faced and the factors that led him to some of these big ideas about pacifism, non-violence, non-attachment?
Well, let's take the early 30s, from 1933 onwards. We have intellectuals who are somewhere between liberal, socialist, communist, and anarchist, who are still under the impression of the First World War and have sworn to themselves that never again should there be a mass slaughter of that order. You have these intellectuals all over Europe, in Germany, in England, in France, and they are the driving force of the pacifist movement in England and in other countries at that time, all the way from Bertolt Brecht in Germany to Bertrand Russell and Huxley, H.G. Wells, and many others in England and scores in the United States. So that's the intellectual scene. And then you have the political scene, which is the gap between intellectuals, the intellectual elite in Europe, and the political landscape of Europe is widening rapidly as the world comes under the control of maniacs. Hitler becomes Chancellor of the Reich in 1933. Stalin's boss of Russia. The purges are in full swing. There's a civil war a brew in Spain that's about to break out, General Franco against independent Republican Spain. Mussolini has his ode on Italy and is waging war in Africa, the Abyssinian campaign, and so on and so forth. So to intellectuals, the alarm bells were ringing more and more desperately by the mid-30s because they felt that insanity was starting to reign in the former free world, in the developed part of the world. And they were starting to talk a little bit the way the intellectual elite in, say, the States and in Europe refers to the present day.
That is very interesting. And of course, there are these analogies that we can draw. So whereas today we have this entity, the United Nations, which seeks to police the world's conflicts, I suppose, back then we had the League of Nations. But there's something about pacifism as a response which requires we kind of look a bit deeper than just good guys or bad guys, right? Because I believe that Aldous Huxley points out in this book, Ends and Means, that the League of Nations formerly required all of its members to have an army. So he describes it as the League of Societies organized for war. So he saw the tendency, although he recognizes, like those other intellectuals did, that what's happening in Russia, in Italy, in Germany is really not good. And, you know, has a preference, I guess, for Western democracy. He still sees the same tendencies. If you have a big army, if you have a big navy, if you have a big munitions industry, then war becomes so much more likely because these weapons need to be used. I mean, at one point he even says, you know, there's a case of a problem of obsolescence with military equipment. You need to use it before your competitor nation develops the next generation of technology. And so actually there's opportune moments to start wars, which really starts to change this framing of what do we, you know, do we just have wars to do urgent ethical work? You know, they're usually justified in humanitarian terms, but clearly for these pacifists, they didn't see any benefit in starting another world war. Welcome back to the Huxley Library in Zurich, apparently, where today we are going to be talking about the question of what would Huxley say about football?
To start us off, I'm going to read a quote from Ends and Means on pages 187 to 188, if you do happen to have a copy open. Huxley writes, like every other instrument that man has invented, sport can be used either for good or for evil purposes. Optimistic theorists count sport as a bond between nations. In the present state of nationalistic feeling, it is only another cause of international misunderstanding. The battles waged on the football field and the racetrack are merely preliminaries to, and even contributory causes of, more serious contests. In a world that has no common religion or philosophy of life, but where every national group practices its own private idolatry, international football matches and athletic contests can do almost nothing but harm.
Nothing but harm.
Wow.
I think Huxley's allowing for the possibility that international sporting tournaments and football in general could be positive under certain conditions. But he's saying where there's no shared philosophy of life or understanding, it's pretty much impossible. And I wonder if there have been any cases where football matches have been triggers for actual armed conflicts. To some extent, you know, every weekend there's like physical fighting over football all around the world. So, you know.
Indeed. And it does remind me almost of the medieval tournaments, I would say, that were almost stand-ins for the act of war in times of peace. So in times of peace, in order to keep the young fighting men in good condition and to channel that energy, there were these organized tournaments or melees where they would almost reenact a battle, but obviously not in the context of genuine warfare. And it seems to me that football almost is a continuation of that impetus, that impetus towards combat and tribalism without that shared philosophy.
Yeah, and he even says, doesn't he, that the battles waged on the football field and a racetrack are merely preliminaries to, and even contributory causes of, more serious contests.
Mm. And absolutely, while thinking about the outcomes of football, it is, I would say, relevant to ask the question, if football is meant to be beneficial as a way that bonds men primarily in communities, and as a way to seek entertainment, as a way for some people to stay fit and healthy, then why can the culture around it be toxic to a lot of people's eyes? Certainly where I lived in Sheffield, there are certain games where the public transportation system is suspended, or you would have certain pubs or venues where away fans aren't allowed to go, which kind of betrays this sense that we accept a certain level of violence around football matches as a payoff to be able to have them. And it seems to create a lot of social discord, this animosity that, again, if it's meant to be something that is socially beneficial, why are so many people unhappy?
Yeah, if football is meant to do us good, and the love of football is almost universal, certainly in many, many countries around the world, why is it not doing us any good?
One of the main causes of war, according to Huxley, was nationalism. The other causes to him were the idolatrous worship of ideologies, which could also obviously include religion. But Marxism, for instance, to him was a modern religion, which was also perfectly capable of being used as an excuse for wars. To make matters worse, in the mid-30s, you had the Great Depression. So the economic situation was quite dire as the States and Europe started to recover from the 29 market crash and all the fallout. Huxley was not convinced that wars were the result of socio-economic forces. He disagreed very strongly of the Marxist ilk that wars were essentially to do with capitalism. And he pointed to the fact that the causes of war were also to do with human psychology. If nationalism and the idolatrous worship of ideologies were two possible causes, then the third was definitely the maniac, the egocentric, the sociopath in charge of a country, and a country that was unlucky enough to come under the control of a maniac, of a tyrant. And he also pointed out that most wars were not fought for economic gain. In fact, capitalists, for instance, had every reason to use weapons because they'd, produced them for the states, for the different governments. But at the same time, they risked ruining their economy and their own, as it were, basis for making money. From Huxley's point of view, capitalism was not the main reason for wars to occur. And apart from defining the League of Nations as an organization for warfare, he also regarded any nation as an institution which was in fact established to wage war.
Yes, and that thread of how, because I think probably important thing to bear in mind here is that for Huxley, as for many people, violence simply begets more violence. And I think this is not so easy for, it will be very easy to understand for some listeners and harder to understand for others who might be very distant from violent conflict. Some might be very close to violent conflict, and we'll see this exactly. But there's just no good that comes from extreme violence, and that's the reason for a pacifist approach, which is no matter how just you think you are being with your violence. And again, Huxley would say, but again, the problem with military violence is it's punishing an entire nation collectively. It's not like a targeted display of justice. It's going to involve dropping bombs on civilians and mangling people and murdering people in the way that indiscriminate heavy weaponry does. And so the only way to oppose the escalation of violence is with non-violence and with pacifism, with not having armies, not starting wars. But I don't want people to think that Aldous Huxley was naive either. I don't think that he understood the difficulty of what he was proposing. And this is something I think that's quite interesting in his thought, because I think he knows, as many people knew, that a new war would be of genocidal significance, which of course it was, and had to be avoided. But he also knew how difficult it was to oppose that war. But like other pacifists, he wasn't cajoled into thinking, well, I just better pick the best side and support that side. And I do feel like that is something that does happen when we assume that wars are inevitable. So there's something quite interesting in Huxley's thought where he says at one point, wars happen because we wish them to. So he's able to believe that we can change this. And I think that's a very powerful viewpoint, because if you believe certain bad things are inevitable, you're just forced to pick a side, to pick the lesser evil. But he doesn't want to do that.
But he completely opposed the sort of social Darwinist stance that wars are intrinsic to human nature and necessary for the purification of the race. He argued that wars are not eugenic, dysgenic. In wars, the casualties, the fatalities are the young and able. The best, in fact, die first. Wars ruin societies. They ruin the gene pool of societies. He was also not convinced that socialists and Marxists had answers to these questions, because a further cause of war to Huxley from the mid-30s onwards was centralization of political power and economic centralization. Economic centralization was, for instance, peculiar to the United States with its big trusts and so on, but it was also happening in the Soviet Union. Political power was coming under the control of oligarchies in the United States, but the same was happening in the Soviet Union. In other words, Marxism and socialism were not conducive to fostering peace, at least not the kind of the socialism of Beatrix Webb, for instance, or the Marxism of Lenin and his successors.
Yeah, so he's definitely taking a stance that's opposing both of those ideologies as dangerous. Although there are figures that Huxley admires, and there's processes and a form of politics which he thinks it's positive, and I think he's also generally quite balanced, evaluating the successes and failures of different ideas and different movements. So, for example, the way that you oppose war and the way that you oppose oppression and oppression society for Huxley is via non-violence as opposed to violence, because violence closes down the possibility of a resolution and causes more violence, of course, and justifies actions of oppression in some ways, because, of course, people are frightened of the violence that's happening. So he says that Gandhi has been successful in South Africa in terms of winning more rights of the Indian population there. He says that it's less of a success at that point in India itself. And as we know, like the outcome in India of Gandhi's movement wasn't not exactly a runaway success, although I guess still significant. But I wanted to talk about non-violence and why this is important, because again, I think we live in a world now where many people do believe that violence is in fact justified to kind of resist oppression. We've grown up with images of people like Che Guevara, of anti-colonial struggles and so on, of violence is an inherent part of pretty much every major film production, whether that is for adults or for children. So heroic violence is lionized in our culture. And so again, it's taking us into a different world of non-violence. Of course, we are aware of the success of non-violent movements, such as the civil rights movement. So it's not like we have no awareness of this, but I wanted to, understand your perspective on what kind of alternative to violent resistance is non-violence, and what are we expecting people to do? How is it supposed to work? It's not an easy thing to suggest, is it? Especially if you're resisting a really violent and oppressive regime or government.
But these questions that you're putting are so very interesting, because we're living in a time where in the developed countries, teenagers are very much pro-army again. My son has just joined the army and spent a year. And personally, many moons ago, I was a major in the Swiss Army, a senior officer. I actually personally don't necessarily agree completely with Huxley's pacifism. At the same time, I feel that my own views are not terribly important. I'm much more interested in going into Huxley's views, because I find them so very challenging, even if you don't agree with him. In other words, he's interesting. And one of the first things that I notice in Huxley and his choice of words, why ends and means, it's because of this utilitarian maxim that the ends justify the means. And that's his trying to say, no, dear utilitarian philosophers, starting with the great Machiavelli in the Renaissance, ends are not justified by means at all. In fact, bad means lead to bad outcomes. Violence engenders violence. In Beyond the Mexic Bay, again, to cite that book, he points to a number of major historical incidents that we tend to overlook that were completely non-violent and led to a very good, permanent, sustainable result. In other words, he says that non-violence can, in fact, bear wonderful fruit. Unfortunately, the thing is, you have to pursue non-violence through a pretty disciplined organization of what he calls, groups of committed individuals, associations of committed pacifist groups, cells, as it were, that should be around 20 to 30 in size and should actually pushed for non-violence and pacifism all over the world. Non-violence isn't just that I don't fight. Non-violence is having the discipline of a Marine not fighting back. Because to take 4 or 5 punches, as the hero does in Aldous in Gaza in 1936, and not hit back, not fight back, that requires superhuman discipline, and that's where the problem really ends up lying. In order to be a true pacifist, you have to be more than an ordinary human being. And that's the point he arrives at in the mid-30s, and that's the most disturbing conclusion that he arrives at. We're reminded of Hermann Hesse in the First World War. And that is, in order to be a genuine pacifist and actually live the life, our being has to change. As we are certain not to be pacifists. As we are definitely violent, potentially. And we're all little Caesars. Remember the Caesar poems by Huxley, written towards the end of the First World War? They surface again in those barren leaves. Well, that's what we really like.
Yeah, and anyone has this potential in that to develop into a Napoleon, into a Caesar, into a figure that, in the interest of ideals, will pursue violence and reshape societies around that. And I agree that these ideas are so interesting because Huxley is such a ambitious thinker for what humans can be, at the same time as recognizing all the issues with getting to that point, that to his mind, this is crucial. And again, it's such a simple point, but yet it's so powerful to say something like, what do we want to become? What are we now? And how do we transition from here to there to recognize we're not everything that we can be? And the example of the training that's required, I think he says 3 or 4 years of training to really use nonviolence as a political tool, because as you said, it requires discipline, to take those blows and to not fight back, requires a period of training.
So now we've come on to the aphorisms section of the podcast, where we take an aphorism that Huxley wrote and discuss it. So this month we are going to take one from Ireland, and the aphorism goes as follows: "We cannot reason ourselves out of our basic irrationality. All we can do is to learn the art of being irrational in a reasonable way."
I was just pointing up to the aphorism on the screen, which we're definitely going to edit in this time.
So for me, I would say that this aphorism is almost an anti-perfectionism mantra, because it seems to me that we, and everybody does this, we set up these moralistic ideals about the kind of people that we should be, the sort of things that we should do, the things that we should think and should feel. And a lot of the time, these feel quite inflexible. And actually, a lot of problems arise from this discord between the logical person that we feel that we should be and the irrational, illogical people that we oftentimes are. Like, we're humans, we're messy, we're not perfect, logical machines.
Mm-hmm. And I think with this aphorism, Huxley's warning us against becoming too imbalanced in either direction, particularly in the direction of reason. And it's interesting, he's writing this in the 1950s in preparation for Ireland, but just a few years before that, theorists like Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer had proposed this idea, looking at the history of the 20th century, that rationality raised to its highest level becomes irrational. And so if you take a rational approach to life and you try to organize society along those rational lines, what you end up is these monstrous, distortions of state power, people being forced to do stuff they don't want to do to fit into this rational vision. So he's kind of warning us we always need to be attentive to the fact that we're always going to be irrational, and we have to understand that to tell them that in a rational way.
Next time someone calls me out on something, I'm just going to tell them that.
Exactly. I'm just being irrational in a reasonable way.
Perfect.
I think we have time to try to deal with one more kind of really interesting idea, which again, I think is so relevant and interesting for today, which is Huxley's idea of non-attachment. Because non-attachment, it doesn't sound good initially, especially to kind of contemporary ears. It doesn't seem to sound great. But I actually think it's a really important idea that deserves explaining. So I wanted to discuss Huxley's definition of non-attachment, and I think perhaps we can understand it more easily by looking at the opposite, attachment. What's wrong with attachment? What's the problem with attachment?
The problem with attachment is that it keeps us in a state of subhumanity. Attachment means that we are so identified with certain things that we forget who we are. We are identified with sex, shall we say, money, power, food, pleasures of different kinds, and maybe ideas, religious beliefs, concepts of any kind that become like fetishes and are then worshipped in lieu of the real thing. So identification is our greatest enemy. And we're constantly identified with all sorts of things. Our ordinary self is constantly hypnotized by wants and wishes. And to become human in a real sense, we have to therefore separate from these obsessions that we have with wonderful political ideas, religious beliefs, our personal greed, and maybe the wish to impress others and score off others and so forth. And what does that then mean? First of all, we have to see that we're not really human. We have to feel the wish for awakening to humanity. We have to actually see that we are hounded all the time, distracted by pseudo-emotions, and our real feelings, much deeper down, are buried. They're not there for us to experience. Just as our deeper thoughts are not there for us in our minds, because our mind is full of rubbish. How do we free our minds from this rubbish tip situation in which it's sort of in? Well, first of all, Huxley suggests that it would be a good idea to try to work on ourselves individually through various forms of meditation. Breathing exercises, he tries them out in the early 30s, relaxing the body, sensing the body. And then beyond that, maybe reflection and contemplation. Why am I so impatient and angry all the time? Why am I so frustrated? What does this mean? Why do I criticize others all the time? Why am I full of judgments immediately when I see someone behaving the way I don't expect or wish? So I'm full of all these automatic impulses all the time. And he suggests getting into groups because he feels that working in a group is very, very helpful to waking up together.
So we're actually going to be introducing another segment to the podcast, a predictions segment. So throughout his writings, Huxley made many predictions about the future, and it's fair to say that some of these are more outlandish than others. In this section, we'll discuss them and assess how well these predictions stand up to the passage of time.
So the prediction we're going to look at this time is one that Huxley made in a book called Science, Liberty and Peace, published in 1947. And in that book, he writes, "The most desirable substitute for petroleum would be an efficient battery for storing the electric power produced by water, wind, or the sun."
So Huxley's point here is more of a social point. His concern is that oil will run out. It's a finite resource, and this will lead to centralized or state forms of power and ultimately war. So this social concern is a bit different from our modern environmentalist vantage point that would drive such statements.
Yeah, so throughout the 1930s, 1940s, he's developing this idea that the economy is structured in a way that tends towards centralized concentrations of power, and energy is a key part of that. And so he doesn't only want to get rid of petroleum or petrol because it's bad for the environment. He wants to get rid of it because it gives very few people the levers of control over everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And he wants people to be able to form self-sufficient local communities, which is where he comes up with this prediction, I guess, that the most desirable substitute would be just a good battery. In terms of whether the prediction was right or wrong, I think that Huxley is right that efficient batteries have indeed been a key focus of technological development. However, I don't think we've fundamentally solved the challenge that these energy sources pose. So any renewable energy system still requires bridging resources, often natural gas, to cover the times when the sun isn't shining, the wind isn't blowing, and so on. And there's another problem, which is the production of efficient lithium-ion batteries is itself extractive, right?
Yes, it is itself using a finite resource, which actually ends us up in exactly the same problem that Huxley's trying to avoid.
Yeah, so there's just not easy answers here, but it is definitely true that Huxley was way ahead of his time in terms of thinking about energy production and sustainability and ecology.
Absolutely.
He has very specific ideas, and I think and very well thought out ideas about what exactly we should do and how we should go about doing that. And one of those is, of course, the right organization of society in terms of groups and political groups and the right size. We don't have time to talk more about that right now, but I do think that you've mentioned before a solution without grace, to the world's problems. A solution that doesn't depend on ideology or belief or technology or, some blind faith in one thing or other that's going to save us, that's going to redeem us in some way. A solution without grace means everybody waking up and getting involved and working on themselves and working together. And I really like that idea because, again, I do feel like, once again, sadly enough, we do live in a world where we are looking to these pseudo-religious ideological solutions to our problems. And that's not the right message to take away.
That's the thing. In Do What You Will, 1929, Huxley was still of the opinion that the solution to the human condition was balanced excess. Now, the more he learned about Stalin and the more he saw Mussolini and Hitler, the more he came to the conclusion that balanced excess was definitely lethal. Because if maniacs of that kind were encouraged to live a life of balanced excess, the rest of the world would be certain to perish. And grace took on a completely new meaning in the mid-30s for Huxley. Grace in the late 20s was still something that smacked too much of conventional metaphysics and maybe traditional Indian spirituality, maybe Christian spirituality of the more conventional kind. But in the mid-30s, Huxley started to see that actually grace is essential. There is no way around grace, because what is grace? Grace is that we wake up and become human. And for that to start to happen, we have to come under a different influence in ourselves. That is actually in world mysticism called grace. It's a helpful influence that exists in us deep down, that is permanently awake, and that is only waiting to surface and assist our ordinary minds. That notion of grace became central to Huxley from the mid-30s onwards. And that's precisely what alienated himself from the socialists and communists, because socialists and communists were trying to say, look, the world's going to pot. We need to change the socioeconomic conditions. That was the socialist and the communist answer. And then the good side of human nature will be certain to appear. And maybe a few million will have to die in the process. And the more Marxist stance was, well, we'll actually have to slaughter about a tenth of the population or more under the dictatorship of the proletariat. So violence will be absolutely essential to creating a new, just, fair, and beautiful world where human nature can finally blossom. In other words, Huxley was convinced that any change in socioeconomic or political conditions would be certain not to improve the human lot. It had to come from inside through inner work. Now, the difficulty with that, of course, is, apart from the uncertain outcome, how many saints are there hand to heart, or even people verging on the saintly? Well, it's the time factor. It takes ages and ages to become a little bit more saintly. And can we ever be sure that we're becoming more saintly? Already the word stinks just slightly, doesn't it? As I use it now.
It does. It does. It does. That is, I think that's a fantastic point to finish on as we open up this conversation about what Huxley was saying we should do to try to make these changes in society. And I will hold myself back, I think, from making any comments about whether there's really enough understanding of modern day exponents of different theoretical approaches or ideologies, how closely imbricated they were with kind of ideologies that did justify mass murder. I think that probably does need to be resurfaced and addressed in some way, because I do sometimes feel that Marxists get a bit of a free pass in that sense that they perhaps shouldn't. But that is not a matter really for this podcast. So for now, I'm going to say thank you so much for your time, Robin, for another profound and interesting journey into the thoughts of Aldous Huxley. And we will resume this next time.
Thanks so much.